A severed head stares down from a wooden spike. Flies crawl across the open eyes. The jaw hangs loose, frozen mid-scream. And carved into the post beneath it, a single word in Persian script, coward. That head belonged to Leonidas, king of Sparta. The man who held the pass at Thermopylae with 300 soldiers against the largest invasion force the ancient world had ever seen. The man who told Xerxes, king of kings, ruler of every land from the Indus to the Nile, to come and take his weapons himself. They took more than his weapons. When the last Spartan fell at Thermopylae, the Persians didn't bury the dead. They didn't honor the fallen the way warriors had honored warriors for centuries before. Instead, Xerxes gave an order that stunned even his own generals. Find the body of the Spartan king. Separate the head from the shoulders. Mount it where every Greek in the known world would hear about it. This is what defiance looks like, the spike declared. This is how it ends. 300 bodies were stripped, mutilated, and left for the dogs. Shields were collected as trophies. Spears were snapped and thrown into piles. The narrow pass where free men had chosen to die rather than kneel was turned into a monument to Persian supremacy. And across the Greek world, people were supposed to see this and submit. They were supposed to look at that head on its spike and understand that resistance was suicide. That the Persian Empire, stretching across 3 continents, commanding millions of soldiers, wielding wealth that made Greek treasuries look like children's coin jars, could not be stopped. Could not be challenged. Could only be obeyed. That was the plan. But the Persians had made a mistake so fundamental, so catastrophic, that it would cost them 50,000 men on a single summer afternoon. They understood how to conquer. They did not understand what they had just created. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. If you're new to this channel, what we do here is tell stories from history the way they deserve to be told. No shortcuts. No watering it down. Just the truth of what happened and why it still matters. A like, a comment, it takes you 2 seconds, but it tells the algorithm to show this video to someone who's never heard this story before. And this story deserves to be heard. So if you're willing, do that for me. Now, let's continue. In Sparta, a young man named Pausanias stood in the temple of Athena when the messenger arrived. He was 24 years old. Broad-shouldered and quiet in the way that made older men pay attention when he spoke. He had been regent for less than a year, appointed to govern in the name of Pleistarchus, the child king too young to rule. Pleistarchus was the son of Leonidas. Which meant Pausanias was not just governing a kingdom. He was holding the throne warm for a dead man's boy. The messenger who entered the temple that morning had ridden for 3 days without sleep. His horse had collapsed at the gates. He walked the final stretch on blistered feet, and when he stood before the regent, he delivered the news with the careful, measured tone of a man who understood that the wrong word in front of the wrong Spartan could be the last word he ever spoke. Thermopylae had fallen. The 300 were dead. The pass was open. The Persian army was pouring south. Pausanias listened without expression. His hands stayed at his sides. His breathing didn't change. The priests in the temple later said they watched his face for any sign of emotion and found nothing. Not grief. Not anger. Nothing at all. When the messenger finished, Pausanias asked one question. Did they recover his body? The messenger's eyes dropped to the floor. The Persians kept it, Lord. A pause. 4. Display. Silence filled the temple. The sacred flames in their bronze bowl crackled and popped. Outside, birds sang. Somewhere in the city, a child laughed. Those who witnessed what happened next would talk about it for the rest of their lives. They would describe the way something shifted behind the regent's eyes. Not rage. Rage is hot and loud and burns itself out. This was different. This was cold. This was permanent. One of the priests would later say it was like watching a door close behind a man's eyes, a door that would never open again. But Pausanias himself felt nothing so dramatic. What settled over his mind was clarity. Pure, absolute, freezing clarity, the kind that strips away everything unnecessary and leaves only the essential question. Not if. How many? Prepare the army, he said. All of it. The messenger blinked. Lord, the Persian numbers. I know what they number. The allied cities may not. I know what they may not. Pausanias turned to face the altar. The flames danced in their bronze bowl, throwing shadows across the stone walls. Tell the Ephors I will consult the oracles. When the gods speak, Sparta will answer. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was so quiet the messenger had to lean forward to hear it. Every link has its place in the chain. Thermopylae was the first. There will be more. The messenger didn't understand what that meant. He wouldn't understand for another 11 months, not until he stood on a ridge above the plains of Plataea and watched 50,000 Persian soldiers die in a single afternoon. But the chain had begun to form. And Pausanias was already forging the next link. The months that followed were harder than any battle. Because Pausanias didn't just need an army. He needed the army. Every Greek city-state that could lift a spear, every allied force that could march in formation, every reluctant politician and stubborn general across the fractured, feuding mess of independent Greek power, he needed all of them. Together. Cooperating. Under Spartan command. Anyone who understood Greek politics knew this was nearly impossible. These were cities that had been at each other's throats for generations. Athens and Sparta had been rivals since before anyone alive could remember. Corinth trusted no one. Megara trusted Corinth even less. Thebes had already surrendered to Persia and was now actively fighting on the enemy's side. Every city nursed grudges that predated the Persian threat by centuries, and every leader carried the weight of his own citizens' pride, their own army's honor, their own political survival. Asking these men to set aside their rivalries and serve under a 24-year-old Spartan regent was not diplomacy. It was an act of will that bordered on delusion. Pausanias didn't care. He had the one advantage that no amount of political maneuvering could manufacture. Athens was burning. The Acropolis, the sacred heart of Athenian civilization, home to temples that had stood for generations, crowned by the ancient olive tree that Athena herself was said to have planted, lay in ruins. Persian soldiers had smashed the statues, toppled the columns, set fire to everything that would burn and taken axes to everything that wouldn't. The sacred olive tree had been cut down to a stump. The temples where Athenians had prayed, married, buried their parents, celebrated their children, all of it reduced to blackened stone and ash. And the people of Athens were scattered across the Greek world like seeds thrown into wind. Refugees crowded every allied city. Families who had owned homes for 10 generations now slept in caves and ate pine bark and begged for water from strangers. Children who had never known hunger learned it overnight. Old men who had served Athens their entire lives sat in foreign streets with nothing left but the memory of everything they had lost. The rage among Athenian soldiers was beyond anything their commanders could control. Aristides, the Athenian general, had been forced to execute 3 of his own men that week, soldiers who had beaten Persian prisoners to death with their bare hands. Not because Aristides disapproved of the impulse, but because dead prisoners couldn't provide intelligence, and intelligence was the only currency that might buy Athens back. When Pausanias met Aristides for the first time, he saw a man whose restraint was costing him pieces of his soul. A man holding himself together through sheer discipline while everything inside him screamed for blood. "Your men want vengeance," Pausanias observed. "My men want to drown the sea in Persian blood." Aristides' voice was flat, scraped raw. "I've had to execute my own soldiers this week. Their families are living in holes in the ground. Their children haven't eaten properly in months. Their city doesn't exist anymore. What exactly do you expect them to want?" "I expect them to want what I want." Pausanias leaned forward. "Total annihilation. Not a rout, not a battlefield victory they can hang a trophy from. Extermination. The kind of defeat that echoes through Persian history for 1,000 years. The kind that makes every future Persian king think twice before he looks west." He held Aristides' gaze. "But that requires patience. And patience requires trust. Can your Athenians trust a Spartan long enough to give them what they want?" Aristides studied the young regent. He saw the calm exterior. He also saw what was behind it, that frozen, locked-away thing that had settled into Pausanias' eyes the day he learned what the Persians had done to his uncle's body. "Can yours be trusted?" Aristides asked. "Leonidas was your blood. I know what they did to him. Every Greek knows. Your men have their own rage to manage. I've thought about that head on its spike every single day for 11 months. Pausanias' voice remained steady. Almost soft. "I've dreamed about it. I've run calculations about it. Do you know what I've concluded?" "Tell me." "One head deserves 50,000. The mathematics of vengeance must be overwhelming, or it means nothing. We are not going to hurt them, Aristides. We are going to break something inside their empire that never heals. Something that makes every Persian soldier flinch the next time he hears a Greek war cry. But we have to be precise. We have to be patient. And we have to do it together." Aristides was silent for a long time. The fire between them crackled. Outside the tent, Greek soldiers sharpened weapons and spoke in low voices about homes they might never see again. Then the Athenian extended his hand. "Show me how." That night, Pausanias gathered his allied commanders around a sand table and began teaching them the first principle of his strategy. "Every element of this battle will flow from the one before it," he said, drawing lines in the sand with a wooden stylus. "Every Persian mistake will trigger the next. Every link in the sequence will strengthen what follows. We are not going to overpower them. We are going to create the conditions for them to destroy themselves." He pointed to terrain features on the rough map. Water sources. Ridgelines. Open plains flanked by hills. "They think like water," he explained. "They flow around obstacles, find weakness, overwhelm through volume. That's how they conquered half the known world. We will not fight water with water. We will think like fire. We will create the conditions for our own spreading. We will choose the ground, control the timing, and make their greatest strengths work against them." His stylus tapped a spot near the center of the map. A plain stretching before the walls of a small, unremarkable city. "Plataea," he said. "This is where we gather the fuel. This is where we light the spark. And this is where the fire consumes everything they've built." The commanders stared at the map. Some nodded. Some frowned. None fully understood the scale of what the young regent was planning. They would understand soon enough. Because the chain was forming now. Link by link, decision by decision, each piece locking into the next with the precision of a weapon being assembled in the dark. Thermopylae was the first link, the wound that demanded an answer. The alliance was the second, the gathering of force that would deliver it. and across the plains of Plataea, camped beside the Asopus River with 300,000 soldiers and the absolute certainty of inevitable victory, the third link waited. His name was Mardonius. And he had no idea what was coming. Mardonius believed he was the smartest man on the battlefield. And for most of his life, the evidence had supported that belief. He was brother-in-law to Xerxes, married into the royal bloodline, trusted with the most critical military command the Persian Empire had ever issued. When Xerxes retreated to Asia after the naval disaster at Salamis, he left Mardonius behind with a simple instruction: finish Greece. Take the hand-picked cream of the imperial army, the Immortals, the Median cavalry, the Bactrian archers, the Scythian horsemen, and grind these quarrelsome barbarians into dust. Mardonius had accepted the commission with something close to pleasure. He understood where Xerxes had gone wrong. The great king had tried to swallow Greece whole, flooding the country with so many troops that his own supply lines collapsed under the weight. He had forced decisive engagements before the Greek alliance had time to fracture on its own. He had fought the war Persia wanted instead of the war Greece feared. Mardonius would not repeat those mistakes. His strategy was elegant in its patience. He would camp in central Greece, position his forces on favorable ground, and wait. Every week that passed without a decisive battle was a week the Greek alliance corroded from within. Every supply wagon the Greeks failed to deliver was another argument between allied commanders. Every unanswered Persian cavalry raid was proof that the Greeks couldn't protect their own people. Time was his weapon. And he had more of it than the Greeks could afford. He chose the plains north of Plataea for his camp, flat, open terrain that favored his massive cavalry advantage. His engineers built wooden palisades around a fortified position large enough to house his entire force. His supply lines ran north to Thebes, whose government had surrendered to Persia and now provided grain, water, and intelligence with the desperate enthusiasm of men who had bet everything on the winning side. From this position, Mardonius watched the Greek army assemble on the ridgeline to the south. His scouts counted them carefully and reported back. 80,000 hoplites. Spartans at the center. Athenians on the left. Corinthians, Megarians, Tegeans, and a dozen smaller contingents filling the gaps. Impressive, Mardonius admitted. The Greeks had managed to gather the largest allied force in their history. But 80,000 against his 300,000 was not a contest. It was arithmetic. And arithmetic did not lie. What interested him more than the numbers was the intelligence about the Greek commander. Pausanias, his spies reported, spent hours each day performing religious sacrifices. He slaughtered goats and sheep, examined their entrails, consulted priests, and waited for divine signs before making any decision. His officers grew visibly frustrated with the delays. His allied commanders argued openly about strategy. The Athenians wanted to attack. The Corinthians wanted to retreat. The Spartans stood in formation and waited for their regent to finish reading animal guts. Mardonius received these reports and felt the warm satisfaction of a man watching his plan unfold exactly as designed. Their commander prays to gods who cannot save them, he told his generals over dinner. While he prays, we will cut his supply lines. While he reads entrails, we will poison his water. While he waits for omens, his allies will tear each other apart. And when the alliance finally shatters, as it must, as it always does with these people, we will sweep the pieces off the board. His generals laughed and raised their cups. The wine was excellent. The evening was warm. Victory was a matter of weeks, perhaps days. What Mardonius did not understand, what no amount of intelligence gathering could have revealed, was that everything he observed was exactly what Pausanias wanted him to see. The sacrifices were real. Pausanias genuinely believed in the gods, genuinely read the entrails, genuinely waited for favorable omens before committing to action. He was Spartan. Religious observance was woven into the fabric of everything Sparta did, from training exercises to marriage ceremonies to the decision of when and where to fight. But the sacrifices served a second purpose that had nothing to do with the divine. Every time Pausanias knelt before an altar and declared the omens unfavorable, he was sending a message to his own troops. Not with words, Spartans distrusted speeches, but with action. The message was simple: we are not desperate. Desperate men rush. Desperate men make mistakes. We wait because we choose to wait. We hold because holding is what we do. And when the moment arrives, the right moment, the only moment, we will move with a force that nothing on this earth can stop. The delays were not weakness. They were compression. Every hour that 10,000 Spartans stood in formation without responding to Persian provocations added pressure to what was already inside them. These were men who had been trained since childhood to absorb punishment in silence. Boys who had been beaten by older students and forbidden to cry out. Adolescents who had been starved and expected to steal food without being caught, and beaten again if they were caught, not for stealing, but for the failure of being detected. Young men who had survived winters naked on mountainsides and summers drilling in full bronze under a sun that could kill the unprepared. Their entire lives had been a process of compression. Take the pain. Hold it. Transform it into something useful. Release it only when the moment demands. Now, standing on the ridgeline above Plataea while Persian arrows killed their brothers, they were reaching a level of compression that even their training had never achieved. The rage was there, of course it was. They were human. They watched friends fall and felt the same fury any soldier feels. But they had been built to contain that fury, to hold it behind walls of discipline until the walls were deliberately opened. Pausanias understood this mechanism better than anyone alive. He was not merely waiting for omens. He was building a weapon. And while he built it, he watched. The Persian cavalry attacks began on the first day and never stopped. They followed a pattern that Pausanias memorized within hours. At dawn, small groups of mounted archers would ride within range of the Greek line, loose volleys of arrows, and wheel away before the hoplites could respond. By mid-morning, larger formations would probe the flanks, testing for weak points, drawing out any units foolish enough to break formation and pursue. At midday, when the sun was directly behind the Persian positions, the main cavalry force would launch coordinated assaults, hundreds of riders sweeping across the plain in waves, filling the air with arrows that caught the sunlight and turned the sky into something that glittered before it killed. Then, as afternoon heat made the bronze armor unbearable and Greek soldiers swayed on their feet from exhaustion, the Persians would pull back and rest. They had the luxury of rotation, fresh units replacing tired ones, an endless supply of horses and riders and arrows. The Greeks had no such luxury. They stood. They absorbed. They died. Day 1, 43 Greeks killed by arrows. No Persian casualties. Day 2, 38 killed. Persian cavalry grew bolder, riding closer, staying longer. Day 3, 51 killed. A Megarian unit broke and pursued a retreating cavalry squadron. They were surrounded and cut down to the last man. Pausanias said nothing when the report reached him. He simply noted the pattern: Persians bait, Greeks chase, Greeks die. Day 4, 60 killed. Persian archers had found the range precisely. They could hit the gaps between shields from 200 yards. Day 5, Pausanias watched a cavalry commander, Persian, young, riding a gray horse with gold tack, lead 3 charges against the Spartan position. Each charge came closer than the last. Each time, the young commander paused at the edge of spear range, studied the Spartan formation, and retreated. He was learning. Testing. Probing. Pausanias watched him the way a hunter watches prey that doesn't know it's being studied. Day 6, the young commander came again. This time he rode close enough that Pausanias could see his face, confident, almost amused. He raised his bow in a mock salute before loosing an arrow that struck the shield of the man standing 3 feet to Pausanias's left. The regent didn't flinch. Day 7, the Persians found the springs. The water sources that fed the Greek position were not well hidden. 2 springs emerged from the base of the ridge, flowing through shallow channels that Greek soldiers had been using to fill water skins and bronze cups since they arrived. On the 7th morning, a Persian cavalry detachment rode directly to these springs, and what they did was simple and devastating. They killed the guards, a small Megarian detachment that never stood a chance against mounted troops in open ground. Then they fouled the water. Dead horses dragged into the channels. Refuse dumped into the pools. Earth and stone packed around the spring mouths to slow the flow to a trickle. By evening, the Greek army was on half rations of water. By the next morning, men were collapsing. Bronze armor in summer heat is a furnace that a soldier wears. It traps sweat, conducts sunlight, turns the body into a sealed oven. Without adequate water, men don't weaken gradually, they shut down. Hearts race. Vision blurs. Muscles seize. A hoplite who was combat-ready at dawn could be unconscious by noon, lying in his own armor like meat left too long over coals. Day 8 brought the first cracks in the alliance. A Corinthian commander marched to Pausanias's command position and spoke loudly enough for every officer within 50 yards to hear. "My men are dying of thirst in a position your strategy chose. We've been here for over a week. We've taken casualties every single day. We've lost our water supply. And you stand here cutting open animals and telling us the gods aren't ready." His voice shook with controlled fury. "When, exactly, will the gods be ready? When we're all dead? When the Persians walk over our dried-out corpses?" Pausanias looked at the Corinthian for a long moment. "Your men are alive because my strategy keeps them in formation instead of charging cavalry across an open plain," he said. "The Megarians tried that on day 3. You know what happened to them. Every unit that has broken discipline is dead. Every unit that has held discipline is still standing. Those are the only facts that matter right now. Facts won't fill their water skins. No. But patience will fill Persian graves." The Corinthian left without being convinced. Behind him, Pausanias could hear the murmur of discontent spreading through the camp like smoke through cloth. Athenians arguing with Tegeans. Megarians refusing to take positions on the exposed flanks. Everyone blaming everyone else. On the 9th day, his own second-in-command confronted him. The man had served Sparta for 20 years. He had scars on his arms from battles Pausanias had been too young to witness. He did not approach with the theatrical anger of the Corinthian. He approached with the quiet gravity of a man delivering a warning between equals. "The men are dying," he said. "Not in battle. From thirst. From heat. From standing still under arrows day after day with no response. This is not combat. This is endurance for the sake of endurance, and there is a limit to what any man can endure." "There is no limit to what a Spartan can endure," Pausanias answered. "That's the entire point of the agoge. That's the entire point of everything we've been since we were 7 years old. Even Spartans. Even Spartans nothing." Pausanias's voice dropped. "Listen to me. Every hour we stand here, Mardonius grows more confident. Every day his cavalry rides unopposed, he believes we are weaker than we were yesterday. Every arrow that finds our bronze teaches his archers that we will never respond. He is learning lessons right now, on this field, that he believes are true. And every single one of those lessons is wrong. He stepped closer to his officer. When we finally move, and we will move, he will expect us to continue playing the role he has written for us. The role of the victim. The passive target. The barbarians who stand and take punishment because they don't know what else to do. He will commit everything based on that expectation. And when reality turns out to be something completely different from what he expects, Pausanias let the sentence hang. His officers studied him. Then, slowly, understanding replaced frustration in his eyes. You're letting him teach himself the wrong lesson. I'm letting him write his own death. All I need is for our men to hold long enough for him to finish writing it. And if they break before then? Pausanias's gaze was steady and absolute. They won't break. Breaking is not something we were built to do. But the Persians will learn that. Very soon now. He returned to his altar, knelt, and reached for another goat. The 10th day dawned hot and merciless. Water was nearly gone. The dead from 9 days of cavalry harassment lay in rows behind the lines, covered with cloaks that no living soldier could spare. The alliance was fracturing along every seam. Half the commanders wanted to retreat. The other half wanted to attack. Nobody wanted to continue standing on a sun-scorched ridge, dying by inches, waiting for a 24-year-old to finish consulting animal organs. The pressure inside 10,000 Spartans had reached a point that defied measurement. 9 days of arrows. 9 days of watching brothers fall. 9 days of holding still while every instinct screamed to charge, to fight, to release the fury that had been building since a messenger walked into a temple and spoke the word display. They were no longer soldiers waiting for orders. They were a detonation waiting for a trigger. And that night, the 10th night, Pausanias finally gave the order that none of them expected. Think about what it takes to stand still while arrows kill the man beside you. Not for minutes. Not for an hour. For 10 days. What kind of training produces that? What kind of human being survives it without shattering? And what happens when 10,000 men like that are finally unleashed? I want to hear your answer, drop it in the comments. The order was retreat. Not advance. Not charge. Not the release that every man in the Greek army had been begging for across 10 days of punishment. Retreat. Pull back. Abandon the position they had bled to hold. When the order reached the unit commanders, some of them thought it was a mistake. A garbled message, a miscommunication in the chain of command. One Spartan officer sent his runner back to confirm, certain that the word had been corrupted in transit. The runner returned with the same instruction, repeated verbatim. Fall back. Tonight. Under cover of darkness. The confusion was immediate and total. But that was nothing compared to what came next. Because the way Pausanias organized the retreat broke every rule of coordinated military withdrawal. Units received contradictory orders. The Athenians were told to pull left, far left, miles from the main body. The Corinthians were directed right, toward a position that seemed to have no tactical value whatsoever. Some contingents received their orders early and began moving before midnight. Others received theirs late and stumbled into the darkness hours after the first units had already gone. There was no synchronization. No unified timetable. No corridor of communication between the moving parts. To anyone watching, and Persian scouts were watching, it looked like an army coming apart at the seams. 80,000 men who had never maneuvered together in daylight were now trying to execute a complex withdrawal in total darkness across unfamiliar terrain. Units collided with each other on narrow paths. Soldiers stumbled into ravines and broke ankles. Commanders shouted contradictory directions into the black and received only confusion in return. Equipment was dropped, abandoned, scattered across miles of ground. By the time gray light crept across the eastern horizon, the Greek army no longer existed as a unified force. 3 isolated groups occupied separate positions miles apart from each other. The Athenians had ended up far to the south and west, clustered near a series of low hills that blocked their view of the main plain. The Corinthians and several smaller contingents had drifted to the east, separated from everyone else by broken ground and dry streambeds. Communication between the groups was impossible without riders, and no riders had been assigned. And in the center, alone on a gentle ridge overlooking the wide, flat plain that stretched north toward the Persian camp, stood 10,000 Spartans. No Athenians on their left. No Corinthians on their right. No allied units within supporting distance. Just 10,000 men in bronze, their backs to the rising sun, completely exposed on ground that offered no natural defense against cavalry. From every tactical perspective that existed in the ancient world, this was a catastrophe. Persian scouts could not believe what they were seeing. They rode back to Mardonius at a gallop, their horses lathered, their reports tripping over each other in the rush to deliver news that sounded too perfect to be real. The Greek alliance had shattered. Their army had broken apart during a panicked night retreat. Units were scattered. Communication was severed. And the Spartans, the backbone of Greek resistance, the warriors who had made Persia bleed at Thermopylae, the only infantry force in the known world that Persian generals genuinely feared, stood isolated and alone on open ground. Mardonius listened to these reports and felt the closest thing to joy his disciplined mind would permit. 10 days of patient pressure had worked exactly as he predicted. The Greek alliance, built on mutual distrust and held together by nothing stronger than shared fear, had collapsed under sustained harassment. Their boy commander had panicked, ordered a retreat, and lost control of his own army in the darkness. This was the moment. The single, unrepeatable moment when the war could be won in an afternoon. All units forward, Mardonius commanded. His voice carried the absolute certainty of a man who has seen the future and found it favorable. Cavalry to engage immediately. Infantry to follow at speed. No reserves. Everything we have. We end this today. 300,000 men began to move. The ground trembled beneath their boots and hooves. Dust rose in clouds that could be seen for miles. The sound of that advance, the drumming of hooves, the rattle of armor, the rhythmic crash of infantry marching in step, rolled across the plain like distant thunder. And on their ridge, the Spartans watched it come. What Mardonius could not see, what his scouts had failed to understand, what no amount of observation from horseback could reveal, was that every piece of the Greek army was exactly where Pausanias had placed it. The chaos was choreography. The Athenians, far to the south and west, were not lost. They were positioned directly across the only road that the Theban collaborators, Greek traders fighting for Persia, could use to reinforce the main battle. When the Thebans moved, the Athenians would be waiting. Not to contain them. To destroy them. The Corinthians, scattered to the east, occupied ground that controlled every path Persian reserves could take to reinforce their center. When Mardonius committed his main force against the Spartans and then tried to bring up fresh troops, he would find those routes blocked by Corinthian spears and the stubborn fury of men who had spent 10 days being insulted by Persian cavalry. And the Spartans, isolated, exposed, apparently abandoned, held the killing ground. The ridge they occupied was not chosen for defense. It was chosen for what lay in front of it, a wide, flat, open plain with no cover, no terrain features, nothing to slow a cavalry charge or break an infantry advance. It was the kind of ground that invited a massed assault. The kind of ground that made a commander with numerical superiority feel invincible. It was a trap shaped like an opportunity. Mardonius saw the open plain and thought, perfect ground for my cavalry. He saw the isolated Spartans and thought, perfect target for my infantry. He saw the broken alliance and thought, perfect moment for total commitment. He was right about all three. He was wrong about what they meant. Because when you commit everything, every soldier, every horse, every reserve, against a force that refuses to break, you leave nothing behind. No fallback. No second line. No escape route. Total commitment against an unbreakable wall is not a tactic. It is a funeral arrangement. The Persian cavalry reached the Spartan position first. They came in waves, hundreds of riders sweeping across the open ground, bows drawn, arrows nocked, confident from 10 days of unopposed harassment. They had learned over the past week and a half that the Greeks stood still. That they absorbed punishment without responding. That they were targets, not threats. They had learned the wrong lesson. But they didn't know that yet. Arrows filled the air. The same whistling shriek that had haunted every Greek soldier for 10 days returned with full force, thousands of shafts per minute arcing across the morning sky, blotting out the light, turning the air itself into a weapon. The sound alone was enough to break untrained troops. The sight of that many arrows in flight, darkening the horizon like a flock of iron birds, had routed armies before. The Spartans did not rout. They did what they had done for 10 days. They stood. Shields up. Formation tight. Eyes forward. Bodies braced. And they absorbed. Arrows punched through shield rims and embedded in forearms. They slipped through eye slits in bronze helmets and killed men instantly. They found the gaps between greaves and thigh guards and buried themselves in muscle and bone. Men fell. The formation compressed. The living stepped over the dying and closed the gaps. No one screamed. No one broke. No one ran. And in the front rank, fully exposed to the storm, Pausanias knelt on one knee and pulled a goat toward the altar stone. He cut the animal's throat with a short knife. Blood ran over his hands and pooled on the ground, mixing with the blood of men who had fallen around him. He opened the belly, examined the entrails, and shook his head slowly. The omens were not favorable. They could not advance. An arrow struck the ground 6 inches from his knee. Another glanced off his helmet with a sound like a hammer striking a bell. A third killed the priest kneeling beside him. The man slumped forward without a sound, an arrow through his throat, his hands still cupped around the offering bowl. Pausanias reached for the bowl before it spilled, steadied it, and called for another goat. His aide grabbed his shoulder hard enough to leave bruises. "Lord, the men. The gods have not spoken." His voice carried no urgency. No fear. He might have been discussing the weather. When they speak, we move. Not before. We're dying standing still. Pausanias looked up. His face was spattered with goat blood and dust and the fine mist that filled the air when arrows struck flesh nearby. His eyes held that same frozen clarity that had settled into them 11 months ago in the temple of Athena. "Yes," he said. "We are. And every death is making what comes next more certain. Can you feel it?" His aides stared at him. "Feel what?" "The pressure." Pausanias turned back to the entrails. "Every arrow adds to it. Every man who falls adds to it. Every minute we hold adds to it. The Persians think they're weakening us. They are building something they cannot imagine. And when it releases. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Because at that exact moment, at the far right end of the Spartan line, the trigger was being pulled. Not by a general. Not by a king. Not by anyone who had planned for this moment. By 1,500 men from a small city called Tegea who had simply absorbed all the pain that human beings can hold. The Tegeans held the most exposed position on the Spartan right flank. They were not Spartans. They had not been forged in the Agoge. They were citizens of a small allied city-state who had joined the coalition because the alternative was Persian slavery, and they had been given the position of greatest danger because someone had to hold it and they had volunteered. For 10 days, they had taken the worst of the cavalry assaults. Their shields were so thick with embedded arrows that they looked like the spines of sea creatures. Their dead lay stacked 3 deep behind the formation because there had been no time and no hands to move them further. Every man still standing had been hit at least once, arrow wounds in arms, legs, shoulders, faces, and every man still standing was held upright by nothing except rage and the knowledge that falling meant the line would break and everyone behind them would die. When a Persian horseman rode within 15 yards of their formation and spat in their direction, a gesture of contempt, casual and deliberate, something inside 1,500 men reached its limit simultaneously. There was no order. No trumpet signal. No commander raising a sword and shouting a battle cry. There was only a sound, a raw, animal roar that came from 1,500 throats at once, and then the Tegean line surged forward like a wave that had been held behind a dam for 10 days and had finally found a crack. They hit the nearest Persian cavalry squadron at full sprint. Heavy infantry against light cavalry at close quarters is governed by physics, and physics does not negotiate. A hoplite in bronze armor weighs over 200 pounds with his equipment. He carries an 8-foot spear and a 3-foot sword. He is trained since adolescence to fight in tight formation, shoulder to shoulder, each man protecting the man beside him. He is, at close range, a killing machine designed for exactly one purpose, destroying whatever stands in front of him. A cavalryman, by contrast, sits on top of an animal that does not want to die. His bow is useless at arm's length. His short sword cannot reach past the hoplite's spear. His horse will not charge into a wall of bronze and bladed wood. And if the horse goes down, the rider goes with it, 200 pounds of armored man hitting the ground at speed, tangled in stirrups and reins, helpless. The Tegeans carved through the Persian cavalry like bronze through linen. Riders went down screaming as spears punched through horse flesh and armor alike. Men who had spent 10 days firing arrows from safe distances suddenly found themselves face to face with opponents who had spent 10 days dreaming about this exact moment. Horses reared in through their riders. Unhorsed Persians were killed before they could stand. The ground became a chaos of thrashing animals and dying men and the relentless forward pressure of 1,500 soldiers who had stopped thinking and started destroying. The Persian cavalry reeled backward. Not an ordered withdrawal. A stunned, stumbling collapse, like a man who reaches into a fire and discovers the fire can reach back. And in that instant, that precise, unrepeatable instant, Pausanias raised both arms toward the sky. He shouted a prayer to Hera, goddess of cities, protector of the hearth. Then he lowered his arms, stood to his full height, and spoke one word. Advance. He did not shout it. He did not scream it. He spoke it in a voice that was almost gentle, the way a man might speak to a child he is waking from sleep. And 10,000 Spartans moved. Not running. Walking. Shields locked edge to edge in an unbroken wall of bronze. Spears leveled in a horizontal forest of sharpened iron. Boots striking the earth in perfect unison, left, right, the rhythm so precise that the ground itself seemed to pulse with each step. They did not look like men charging into battle. They looked like a wall advancing across the earth. A bronze tide that did not accelerate, did not waver, did not make a single unnecessary movement. Every step was identical to the one before. Every man moved in perfect concert with the man beside him. The formation was so tight that from a distance, it appeared to be a single entity, not 10,000 individuals, but one enormous weapon, walking. Across the plain, Mardonius watched the advance, and for the first time in 10 days, something cold settled into the base of his spine. He had seen Greek charges before. At Thermopylae, at Marathon, at a dozen smaller engagements across the campaign. They were always the same, desperate, disordered rushes by men who knew they were outmatched, hoping to close the distance before Persian arrows thinned their ranks beyond recovery. This was nothing like that. This was not desperation. This was machinery. This was something that had been compressed beyond its limit and was now expanding with a force that had no interest in stopping. But Mardonius was Mardonius. He had conquered provinces. He had broken armies. He had never retreated from anything in his life. Immortals forward, he commanded, and his voice did not waver. Meet them head-on. The elite of the Persian Empire, 10,000 immortals, hand-selected, magnificently armed, undefeated in living memory, stepped forward to intercept the Spartan advance. Their scale armor caught the morning light. Their formation was crisp and professional. Their reputation preceded them like a shadow. The two forces closed across 600 yards of blood-soaked ground. 500 yards. 400. 300. At 200 yards, both sides could see each other's faces. At 100, they could see each other's eyes. At 50 yards, the Spartans lowered their spears from vertical to horizontal, 10,000 iron points dropping into a killing line with a single collective motion that sounded like the world inhaling before a scream. And then the two finest infantry forces on earth collided. The collision made a sound that survivors would carry to their graves. Not the clean ring of metal on metal that poets would later describe. Something worse. Something wet and heavy and final, the sound of 10,000 spear points meeting 10,000 human bodies at walking speed, multiplied by the weight of bronze armor and the momentum of men who had waited 10 days to do exactly this. The first rank of immortals ceased to exist in under 4 seconds. They were the best Persia had. Warriors selected from across the empire for size, strength, skill, and ferocity. Men who had never lost a battle, never given ground, never known what it felt like to face an opponent they could not overcome. They learned in those 4 seconds. The mathematics were brutal and inarguable. A Spartan spear measured 8 feet from butt spike to iron point. A Persian spear measured 6. Those 2 feet of difference meant that Greeks could drive iron into Persian throats before Persian weapons could touch Greek flesh. And behind those spears stood men encased in bronze, breastplates, greaves, helmets, shields, armor that turned Persian swords the way stone turns rain. The immortals' weapons skidded and bounced off surfaces they were never designed to penetrate. The Persians fought with extraordinary courage. That was never in question. They threw themselves against the Spartan wall with everything they had, stabbing at gaps beneath shields, hacking at spear shafts, grappling with armored men twice their effective weight. Individual immortals performed acts of bravery that would have earned them legends in any other battle. But individuals die. Formations kill. The Spartan phalanx did not fight as individuals. It fought as a single mechanism, each man a component in a machine designed for one purpose. The front rank stabbed. The second rank pushed. The third rank replaced the fallen. When a Spartan went down, the man behind him stepped forward, locked his shield into the gap, and continued the advance without breaking stride. There was no hesitation. No pause to mourn. No gap that lasted longer than a heartbeat. Thrust. Recover. Step forward. Thrust again. The rhythm was mechanical, almost industrial. Men who had stood motionless under arrow storms for 10 days now channeled everything they had absorbed into the precise, repetitive act of killing. Their faces showed nothing. No rage. No triumph. No satisfaction. Just the blank concentration of craftsmen performing work they had trained their entire lives to execute. The second rank of immortals buckled within a minute. The third rank held for slightly longer, perhaps 90 seconds, before the pressure from the front combined with the weight of their own dead made standing ground physically impossible. Bodies piled so quickly that the living had to climb over the fallen to reach the enemy, and climbing meant losing footing, and losing footing against a Spartan phalanx meant dying on your knees. Mardonius watched his center collapse and felt something he had never experienced on a battlefield. Doubt. His immortals were being consumed. Not defeated, consumed. The Spartan line was swallowing them rank by rank, grinding forward at a walking pace that never accelerated and never slowed, leaving nothing behind but corpses stacked in rows so neat they looked almost deliberate. He had seen armies break before. He had seen troops falter, lose nerve, turn and run. That was normal. That was the rhythm of battle as he understood it. This was different. This was not breaking. This was erasure. He turned to his left flank, hoping for relief. What he saw instead turned out into the first cold thread of genuine fear. The Athenians had arrived. Not where Mardonius expected them, scattered, lost, irrelevant after the botched night retreat. They emerged from behind the low hills to the southwest in full battle formation, 8,000 hoplites moving in lockstep, and they struck the Theban collaborators with the accumulated fury of men whose city had been reduced to ash and whose families were still living in caves. The Thebans, Greeks fighting for Persia, traitors to their own people by every standard the allied army recognized, fought hard. They had no choice. Surrender to Athens meant execution. Flight meant dishonor. They stood their ground with the desperate courage of men who had burned every bridge behind them. It was not enough. The Athenians hit them like a hammer striking glass. The Theban center shattered on contact. Their flanks folded inward as Athenian wings swept around them with practiced coordination. Within minutes, the Theban force, 5,000 strong, well-equipped, fighting on familiar ground, was surrounded, compressed, and being systematically destroyed. Mardonius lost his left flank in the time it took to issue 3 orders. He turned to his right. The Corinthians were there, emerging from the broken ground to the east, cutting the supply roads, blocking every path that Persian reserves might use to reinforce the center. They moved without haste, setting up blocking positions with the methodical patience of men who had spent 10 days being insulted and were now delivering the invoice. The trap was closing from 3 directions. And at the center, the Spartan advance continued. Step by step. Body by body. The immortals had stopped fighting as a unit and were now dying as individuals, each man swallowed by the bronze tide, each death adding to the wall of corpses that the living had to navigate. Mardonius understood, in a single terrible moment of clarity, what had happened. The retreat was never a retreat. The collapse was never a collapse. Every piece of the Greek army had been placed with precision, and he had charged his entire force into the gap between them, committing everything, holding nothing back, exactly as Pausanias had designed. He had walked 300,000 men into a killing box. And now the box was closing. There are moments in battle when the outcome is already decided but the fighting has not yet stopped. Moments when one side knows it has lost but continues to struggle because surrender is not available and escape is not possible. Moments when courage becomes indistinguishable from futility. Mardonius reached that moment and made a decision that history would remember as either his finest act or his most foolish. He chose to fight. He mounted his white horse, a magnificent animal, visible across the entire battlefield, as distinctive as a flag. He gathered his personal bodyguard, 1,000 of the best cavalry troops in the Persian Empire. And he charged directly at the Spartan line. He did not charge to escape. He did not charge to create a diversion. He charged because he was Mardonius, brother-in-law to the King of Kings, commander of the largest army west of the Indus, and he would not die running from barbarians in bronze helmets. The charge was magnificent. There was no other word for it. 1,000 horsemen in gold-trimmed armor, flowing capes snapping in the wind, riding at full gallop toward an advancing wall of spears, led by a man in golden armor on a white horse who held his sword above his head and screamed a battle cry that carried across the plain. For a moment, a brief, shining, desperate moment, the charge worked. Persian soldiers saw their commander riding toward the enemy with total disregard for his own life, and something inside them caught fire. Units that had been wavering steadied. Men who had been backing away turned and advanced. The collapse of the Persian center slowed, then stopped, then reversed as warriors drew courage from their leader's example. The battle hung in perfect balance. 10,000 Spartans grinding forward. 1,000 Persian cavalry smashing against their flank. 300,000 men on a blood-soaked plain, the outcome suspended on a knife's edge. And then a Spartan named Achaemenid settled the question. He was not a king. He was not a noble. He was not anyone whose name would have been remembered if the next 30 seconds had gone differently. He was a soldier in the middle ranks of the phalanx, a man who had stood in formation for 10 days, who had watched arrows kill the men beside him, who had stepped over their bodies and closed the gaps and held his position because that was what Spartans did. He saw Mardonius. Not the golden armor. Not the white horse. Not the symbols of rank and power that identified the Persian commander to everyone else on the field. Achaemenid saw the man who had ordered the cavalry raids. The man who had poisoned their water. The man who had sent arrows into their formation day after day while they stood and bled and held and waited. He saw the man responsible. And he acted with the directness of a soldier who has no interest in glory and no capacity for hesitation. He bent down and picked up a stone from the ground. The battlefield was littered with them, rocks churned up by hooves and boots and the weight of dying men pressing into the earth. This one was the size of a fist, rough-edged, heavy enough to carry force over distance. Achaemenid threw it. Not a spear, designed for the purpose. Not a javelin, weighted for accuracy. A rock. A piece of the ground itself, grabbed and hurled with 10 days of compressed fury behind it. The stone struck Mardonius in the temple. It hit the gap between the cheek guard and the crown of his golden helmet, a space no wider than 2 fingers, a target that no amount of practice could have guaranteed hitting. But rage does not aim the way training aims. Rage finds its own trajectory. The stone crushed through gold and bone alike. Mardonius's head snapped sideways. His body went rigid for a fraction of a second, one frozen instant in which the most powerful military commander in the Persian Empire was suspended between life and death, and then he toppled from his white horse and hit the ground with the heavy, final sound of something that would never rise again. Dead before the dust settled around him. Silence radiated outward from the point of impact like a shockwave. Not literal silence, the battle still raged, men still screamed, iron still struck bronze. But a different kind of silence. The silence of an army watching its center of gravity disappear. The 1,000-strong bodyguards saw their commander fall, and the sound that came from their throats was not a war cry. It was a keen, a mourning wail that spread through the Persian ranks faster than any order could travel, carrying a message that needed no translation. He is dead. Mardonius is dead. The commander is gone. And with that message came the collapse. Not gradual. Not orderly. Total. Persian units that had been fighting with courage and conviction seconds earlier simply stopped. Some threw down their weapons. Some turned and ran. Some stood frozen, unable to process the transition from certain victory to certain destruction, their minds failing to bridge the gap between what they had expected and what was happening. 300,000 men became a crowd. A crowd became a mob. A mob became a stampede. And behind them, walking at the same steady, unhurried pace they had maintained since the word advance was spoken, the Spartans followed. What followed was not warfare. The word does not apply to what happened on the plains of Plataea after Mardonius fell. The Persian army ran north. Toward their camp. Toward the wooden palisades their engineers had built weeks earlier, walls designed for shelter, not for siege. They ran in a mass so dense that men trampled each other, so desperate that soldiers threw away weapons and armor to move faster, so panicked that units collided in the narrow approaches and created human dams of tangled bodies that blocked retreat for everyone behind them. The Spartans did not run after them. They walked. The same formation. The same pace. The same mechanical rhythm of boots on earth that had carried them across the killing ground. Shields still locked. Spears still level. They advanced into the wreckage of the Persian retreat the way a blade advances through grain, steady, unhurried, cutting everything it touched. Persians who stopped to fight were killed in formation. Persians who tried to surrender found spear points in their throats before the words left their mouths. Persians who fell and could not rise were stepped over and left for the ranks behind to finish. There was no mercy in it. There was also no cruelty. There was nothing personal at all. The killing had the quality of work, necessary, methodical, carried out with the efficiency of men who had been trained to do exactly this and nothing else. Every arrow that had struck Spartan flesh over 10 days was being answered. Every friend who had fallen under Persian cavalry fire was being paid for. Every day of thirst, every night of standing watch over the dead, every hour of holding still while every instinct demanded action, all of it was being converted into a currency of Persian blood, and the exchange rate was exactly what Pausanias had promised Aristides on the night they clasped hands. Overwhelming. Mathematical. Final. The Persian camp became the last act of the killing. 50,000 men crammed behind wooden walls that had never been designed to withstand assault. The palisades were meant to keep out bandits and wild animals, not armored infantry with 10 days of compressed rage driving their spear arms. The walls lasted minutes. Greek axes and Spartan shoulders broke them apart like kindling, and then the slaughter moved inside. The Athenians reached the camp from the southwest, having finished the destruction of the Theban collaborators. They entered the compound with the specific, focused violence of men whose homes had been burned, whose temples had been desecrated, whose families were eating pine bark in caves while Persian officers dined on silver plates in silk tents. They found those silver plates. They found those silk tents. And they destroyed every living thing between themselves and the proof of what Persian occupation had cost them. The Spartans arrived from the south. Were the Athenians killed with fury, individual, personal, raw, the Spartans killed with system. They formed lines across the width of the camp, advanced shoulder to shoulder, and drove everything in front of them toward the northern wall. Men, horses, servants, officers, all pushed backward by the steady advance, compressed into smaller and smaller spaces, until there was nowhere left to go. The sounds from inside that camp carried for miles. Villagers in the surrounding hills heard them and would refuse to speak of what they heard for years afterward. The sounds lasted until full darkness made it impossible to tell friend from enemy, and even then, Greeks with torches moved through the wreckage, finishing what daylight had started. By the time the sun rose over Plataea the following morning, the mathematics were complete. 50,000 Persian soldiers lay dead on the plain and inside the camp. Their bodies covered the ground so thickly that in places, it was impossible to walk without stepping on the fallen. 50,000 more had fled north during the night, but flight offered no salvation. Greek cavalry harried them along every road. Local villagers, farmers, shepherds, tradesmen who had spent months hiding from Persian occupation, emerged from their refuges with axes, hammers, scythes, and the quiet fury of people reclaiming what had been taken from them. The roads north became corridors of death that stretched for miles. Of the roughly 300,000 men Mardonius had led onto the plains of Plataea, fewer than half would ever see Persian soil again. And many of those who made it home carried wounds that would kill them in the weeks and months that followed. Greek losses across the entire engagement, 1,036 dead. Spartan losses, 91. One head on a spike, answered with 50,000 corpses on a plain. The mathematics Pausanias had described to Aristides, overwhelming, undeniable, designed to break something inside the enemy that would never heal, had been executed with precision that bordered on prophecy. Pausanias found the body of Mardonius in the late afternoon, after the killing had mostly stopped and the living had begun the grim work of separating the dead from the merely broken. The Persian commander lay where he had fallen from his white horse. His golden armor was dark with blood and dust. His cape, once flowing and brilliant, was torn and ground into the mud beneath him. His skull was caved in on the left side, the damage from Aenestus's stone clearly visible, a rough depression in the golden helmet and the bone beneath it. He looked smaller in death than he had in life. They always do. Pausanias stood over the body for a long time. His officers gathered behind him, waiting. Several of them had already discussed what should happen next, and they had reached a consensus that they now presented to their regent with the confidence of men who believed justice was on their side. "The Persians mounted your uncle's head on a spike," one of them said. "They displayed it above Thermopylae for the world to see. They called him a coward. They mutilated his body and left it for animals." He paused. "This man gave those orders. Let us return the gesture. Let every Persian who survived today carry the image of their commander's head on a Greek spear back to Susa. Let Xerxes see what we do to the men he sends against us." The others murmured agreement. It was fair. It was proportional. It was, by the brutal standards of ancient warfare, expected. Pausanias looked at Mardonius's ruined face for another long moment. Then he turned to his officers, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same cold clarity it had held since the day a messenger walked into the temple of Athena and changed everything. "We are Greeks," he said. "Not barbarians. The dead have paid their price. All of it. There is nothing left to collect." He ordered the body buried with full military honors. A proper grave. A proper marker. The only mercy extended on a day that had been defined by its absence. Some of his officers protested. Pausanias did not argue with them. He simply repeated the order and waited until it was carried out. It was not compassion. Pausanias was not feeling compassionate. He was feeling something far more calculated than that. He wanted Persia to know, not to guess, not to wonder, but to know that the Greeks who had destroyed their army were not savages driven by bloodlust. They were civilized men who could annihilate 300,000 soldiers in an afternoon and then bury the enemy commander with dignity. The Persians had desecrated Leonidas because they wanted to send a message about the futility of resistance. Pausanias buried Mardonius because he wanted to send a different message entirely. A message about the kind of people who had just broken the most powerful military force on earth. A message that said, "We did this. We did it deliberately. We did it completely. And we are still who we were before we did it." That message, Pausanias understood, would cut deeper than any blade. Night came to the plains of Plataea, and with it came the silence that follows catastrophe. The victory fires burned across miles of ground. Greek soldiers sat in clusters around the flames, eating food taken from Persian supply wagons, drinking wine meant for Persian officers, wearing cloaks stripped from Persian dead. They sang songs, old songs, battle songs, songs their fathers had taught them, and the sound carried across the darkened plain and mixed with the other sounds of the aftermath. The moaning of wounded men no one had reached yet. The calling of carrion birds already descending in enormous flocks. The occasional sharp cry of a Greek soldier who found a friend among the dead and broke, briefly, before the man beside him gripped his shoulder and pulled him back. Pausanias did not join the celebrations. He climbed a small hill at the southern edge of the battlefield, above the fires and the singing and the sounds of men trying to process what they had survived. The air up there was thick with the smell of death, that particular smell, sweet and metallic and utterly unlike anything else in the world, that no soldier ever forgets and no civilian ever truly understands. From the hilltop, he could see the entire plain. The fires of 80,000 Greeks spread below him like fallen stars. Beyond them, in the darkness, the killing ground stretched north toward the ruins of the Persian camp. He could not see the bodies in the dark, but he knew they were there. 50,000 of them. Lying in rows where the phalanx had passed. Piled against the camp walls where the final assault had driven them. Scattered along the roads north where cavalry and villagers had hunted them through the failing light. 50,000. 4-1. Below him, the alliance was already beginning to crack. He could hear it in the arguments drifting up from the campfires. Athenians claiming the largest share of spoils because their city had suffered most. Corinthians demanding recognition for blocking the Persian reserves. Tegeans insisting their spontaneous charge had been the turning point of the battle. Every contingent claiming credit. Every leader positioning himself for the political battles that would follow the military one. Pausanias understood what this meant. He understood it with the same cold clarity that had defined every decision he had made for the past 11 months. Plataea had ended the Persian threat to Greece. The invasion was over. No Persian army would cross the Aegean again. The empire that had stretched its hand toward Europe and tried to close its fist around Greek freedom had drawn back a stump, and the memory of this day would keep it drawn back for generations. But Plataea had also removed the only force that held the Greek alliance together. Fear of Persia was the glue. Without it, every old rivalry, every ancient grudge, every competing ambition that had been set aside in the face of existential threat would come flooding back. Athens and Sparta, allies today, would be enemies within a generation. The war that followed, Greeks killing Greeks, the same discipline and ferocity that had destroyed Persia turned inward, would bleed both powers white and leave them vulnerable to the next conqueror who came calling. The chain reaction would continue. It always continues. That is the nature of chains. And Pausanias himself would become proof of that principle. The architect of Greece's greatest victory would not age well into the role of peacetime leader. The cold clarity that had made him lethal on the battlefield would curdle into ambition without direction. Within a decade, he would be caught negotiating secretly with the very empire he had gutted, offering to become Persia's man in Greece, trading the freedom he had purchased with 50,000 lives for personal power and the hollow title of a puppet king. His own people would judge him for it. Sparta, which forgave almost anything except disloyalty to Sparta, would condemn him. They would chase him into the temple of Athena, the same temple where he had stood as a 24-year-old regent and heard the news that changed his life, and they would wall up the doors. They would brick shut the windows. And they would leave the greatest military commander of his generation to die of thirst and starvation in the dark, surrounded by the gods he had prayed to on the morning he saved Western civilization. His mother, according to the histories, laid the first brick. But all of that was years away. On this night, this specific August night in 479 BCE, none of it had happened yet. The future was still unwritten. The chains were still being forged. And Pausanias stood on his hill above the killing fields, 25 years old, victorious beyond anything any Greek commander had achieved before him, and he allowed himself one moment. Just one. He looked north, toward Thermopylae, toward a narrow pass where a wooden spike had once held his uncle's head, and he spoke two words into the darkness. "Uncle. The debt is paid." No one heard him. No one recorded it. No historian was present to transcribe the moment for the ages. But it happened nonetheless, a young man speaking to the dead, confirming that the ledger was balanced, that the mathematics of vengeance had been satisfied, that the chain reaction which began with a severed head had reached its conclusion in 50,000 corpses spread across the plain below. Then he turned and walked back down the hill to rejoin his men. There was work still to do. Wounded to tend. Dead to bury. Spoils to divide. An alliance to manage for as long as it could be managed. The moment of satisfaction was over. The cold clarity returned. 25 centuries have passed since Plataea. The plain where 50,000 men died in a single afternoon is farmland now. Olive trees grow where the Spartan phalanx advanced. Wheat covers the ground where the Persian camp burned. The ridge where Pausanias knelt and read the entrails of goats while his men died around him is a gentle slope that hikers cross without knowing what happened there. But the earth remembers. Every spring, when farmers plow their fields, they turn up arrowheads. Bronze points, green with age, still sharp enough to cut skin. They find fragments of bone. Pieces of armor. The small, anonymous remnants of men who traveled thousands of miles from homes in Persia, Media, Bactria, and Scythia to die on a plain they had never seen, in a country they did not understand, for a cause that collapsed the moment a stone struck their commander's skull. The Greeks learned something at Plataea that they spent the rest of their civilization trying to forget. They learned that the men who built democracies and wrote philosophies and sculpted gods from marble were capable, under sufficient pressure, of transforming into something that operated beyond mercy. That discipline could become devastation. That patience could become slaughter. That the line between the soldier who defends civilization and the force that obliterates everything in its path is not a wall. It is a choice. And given the right circumstances, enough pain, enough loss, enough time standing still while arrows kill the people you love, that choice becomes very easy to make. Every civilization rests, at least in part, on the knowledge of what its founders were willing to do when survival demanded it. The temples and theaters and philosophical academies that would define Greek culture for millennia, all of it was built downstream from a blood-soaked afternoon where disciplined men walked through a field of dying enemies and did not stop until there was nothing left to kill. The Spartans understood this. They had always understood it. It was the foundation of everything they were. The question that echoes across 25 centuries is whether we do. If this story changed how you think about Plataea, or about what courage and vengeance really cost, tell me in the comments. Was Pausanias a hero, or was he something else entirely? Did Greece save its civilization that day, or did it reveal something about civilization that we'd rather not examine? I want to hear your honest answer. Like this video if it earned it. Subscribe if you want more stories told this way, without flinching, without shortcuts, without pretending that history was cleaner than it actually was. And share this with someone who needs to hear it. The algorithm only pushes what people engage with, and this story deserves to reach further than it has. I'll see you in the next one.